According to the International Monetary Fund, China could surpass America as the world's largest economy by the end of this year. Let's discuss this further. We're now joined in our Johannesburg studios, as always, by our geo-economic analyst, our regular guest here, Mr. William Gumede. As always, a great pleasure to see you here, sir. Now, the IMF has predicted that the Chinese economy will overtake that of the US in 2019. But it seems that the process has actually been accelerated. Might happen even sooner than expected. What events really accelerated this growth before time, really?
I mean, you know what has happened in the last couple of years? If you can imagine, a couple of years ago, I mean, the IMF and other economists, independent economists, predicted that, you know, China will actually only surpass the US in terms of, you know, the size of the economy, sort of in the mid-2020s. Suddenly now, I mean, you know, this process has been accelerating. You know, what has happened? I think the global financial crisis has really slowed down the US economy. That's the first thing. You know, there's been a slowdown the last 3-4 years. And then, but while at the same time there's been a slight slowdown in the Chinese economy has still been growing. I mean, it's been growing double-digit figures until about this year and last year when it dropped just below 8%. But if you think about the US and other, you know, industrial countries, they're only growing at sort of 1%, just over that, under 2%. So it's just, you know, during the global and Eurozone financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and the aftermath, 2009 and 2010, you know, when industrial economies have slowed down, China is really, they've maintained the economic growth momentum.
Are you surprised by this? I mean, I think this was sort of expected, but obviously not as soon as this, but are you surprised that it did happen this soon?
You know, I guess not surprised, but, you know, it was bound to happen. Yeah. I think what is happening here, we see is, I think it's a symbolic shift in the world. You know, where we're seeing in emerging markets really, you know, are now starting, you know, to grow big as a shift in symbolic power in the world. Although, you know, one have to say that the measurement that the IMF used this time in their calculations, you know, comparing the size of the Chinese economy and the US economy, was based, you know, on price parity. So essentially what they've done, they've looked at both countries and economies, and then they've looked at, you know, the currencies, you know, what you could buy. If you're in China and you use the Chinese currency, you can buy more things with that currency, and things are also cheaper. So with the US dollar, if you're in the US, you know, things are more expensive and so on. So if that's how they weighted the two economies. But although if one take a much more traditional way of looking at, you know, real GDP way of measuring the economy, then the US economy is still, you know, the largest economy in the world.
We'll go back to that, but what I want to ask is, do you think that we will see these growth levels maintained, though?
You know, I think we have a couple of bumps ahead for the Chinese economy. I mean, what they're busy doing is they're busy restructuring that economy. Essentially, what they've been since November last year at the Chinese Communist Party, you know, National Conference, they decided to change a couple of things. And the first thing is they've changed, you know, they've reduced the state involvement in the economy. So, you know, they're opening up for the private sector to get more involved. Secondly, also, they've intervened in the property market of the economy. And then thirdly, I mean, one of the main reasons why the Chinese economy has been growing so much is that the Chinese really has allowed their municipalities and their provinces, you know, to borrow money for infrastructure. So what they've done now is they cut down on that, which just means that I think we're going to have slower growth in the Chinese economy. I don't think for the next few years we're going to get to double-digit figures. You know, we're going to get the 7 to 8%. Of course, you know, that kind of growth is still really good if you're a developing country or even a, you know, industrialized country. But I mean, you know, the moral of the story, the short end of it is we're not going to get that double-digit growth most probably, you know, in the Chinese economy going forward.
Now, William, I want to talk about the GDP, China's GDP versus that of the US. You touched on it. I want to come back to that. Now, the IMF warns that though China's GDP may be larger than that of the USA, it still lags behind in terms of GDP per capita. And are the two ever really reconcilable, GDP and GDP per capita? I mean, it does seem very complicated to the ordinary man. Can you maybe go into that for us?
I mean, you know, there is a debate among economists. I mean, you know, the traditional way of looking at it, if you look at, you know, if you take an individual in a country and you bring all of the individuals together and you see what each of them gets, you know, per individual, and then you know, calculate percentage, you sum it all up, and then you measure your economy. That's one way you do it. The other way, what you could do is, what the IMF have done now is using price parity. They looked at, okay, what can you buy with, Chinese currency, and what can you buy if the individual, US currency. So if you measure the economies that way, then the Chinese economy is bigger. Now, if you do it a traditional way, if you look at it, many people in China, large proportions of China are poor people. So, per capita income, if you compare it with a typical US citizen, if you compare the two, really, the US is a richer country. They have less of, the poverty problems, less of the unemployment problems. So that really is a big factor. So the Chinese, although they're growing, and they've got this big economy, they still need to deal with all of the structural problems, poverty, inequality, and so on.
Now, we know that China is important in Africa, but I think what's important as well is when China does overtake the US, what will this mean for the global political economy at large?
I mean, already now, even this announcement this week with the IMF, saying that the Chinese economy is growing, is already, I think, changed the global political ball game, because suddenly I think the expectation now is, because China is now, the big economy in the world, or the economy of the future, that it needs to have much more powers, in, let's call it, global forums, where there's the UN, where there's the World Trade Organization, and so on. So that really is going to be a game changer from that point of view.
All right, William, it's always a great pleasure having you here in studio with us. Thank you very much for that informative discussion. That's, of course, our geo-economic analyst, Mr. William Gumede, joining us here in our Johannesburg studios.